This is a video for how to go about constraining your corner guide block pieces for your Trammel toy construction in Fusion 360. You'll notice that on the screen I have the Trammel base created, and when I created it out of two separate parts. So you'll see here in my kind of my menu over here that I have a top part and a bottom part kind of on top of each other here. Now in a video that I will link in the descriptive part of this video, I have gone through and shown how to create this base plate from drawings and also from taking measurements from a physical base plate with a dial caliper. So if you have not made this base plate yet, you can reference that video to make the base plate and then come back to this video. So on the left hand side of my screen, in my project menu, you'll notice I have a lot of different parts over here, and down here I have those two pieces, and I've gone ahead and constrained both of those together here. We're going to go ahead and create another assembly where I'm going to start dragging and dropping assembly parts into the screen. So I'm going to get out of my Trammel base, and I'm going to create for myself just a brand new blank project file. And you'll notice over here when I got out of my Trammel base, it kind of shows up back over here on the screen. And I'm going to hit save, and I'm going to call this Trammel assembly. And I'm going to hit enter for save. And it's going to give this kind of blank, this kind of blank white box over here, and that means it's just waiting to see what I'm going to put in there. You can also see the letter M is here for my name, and you can see what's open over here on the screen. So I'm going to click and hold down, and I'm going to drag this out into my screen. And you'll notice we have our X and Y axis, and automatically it's going to lock right to that origin, and I can see over here with the X, Y, and Z, it's going to lock that into place. And you can even see that there's an example of, the icon we see for a sub-assembly right here. And what sub-assembly means is it knows that there's two pieces in here. We've already assembled something else, so I'm taking an assembly that already exists for two pieces and dragging it in. If you reference the video and use the video that I referenced at the beginning of this instructional video, that's only going to be one piece. For the sake of what I'm doing, it's two pieces, and I'm just going to go ahead and say OK. Now it is locked at the origin. I'm going to right click on my Trammel base once I drag that in and place it. I'm going to go to ground. And what ground means is there's now 0 degrees of freedom. It should just be locked into place. It's letting me drag it around a little bit. I can come into here, and try to ground both of these pieces as well. I'm just going to say capture position for each of these. I'm going to say ground for each of them. And now it won't let me drag them around. So sometimes in your sub-assemblies, you have to go in and ground specific pieces. I grounded this because I do not want it to move at all. I really don't want it to move. I want it to stay put while I put things together. In Fusion, one of the things about Fusion is we're actually putting things together virtually in the exact same way we would in the physical world. And so this will start to make a little bit more sense as time goes on. So I'm going to come up to my correct Trammel pieces, and the first one we're going to start out with, if you don't want to see the name of something that has a long name, you can just right click and go to rename, and I can see, this one right here is called, our LL corner guide block, and this one has kind of a little square in the bottom of it that'll fit down in this area. And I'm going to click and hold down and just drag that out and drop it. Just going to drag and drop, and automatically it kind of is intuitive and kind of sees where it might go, but we want to make sure we join this together. Like this right here is not a constrained piece. It's not constrained at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to click and hold down on this little circle right here, and we're going to drag up and just let go. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK. You'll notice that as we start constraining things, we're going to see these things called joints. And within my sub-assembly up here, you can see that I have joints together, and I have one rigid joint, and I put these two things together, and rigid is almost like gluing something together, making sure it's never going to move again. So think if I just put a whole bunch of glue on the top of this piece down here and slap the bottom piece on top of it. That's kind of how that would work. So we're going to do a rigid constraint of this yellow piece that has this, rectangular prism on the bottom, and you can kind of see how that's going to snap into place into here. It's important when we put these guide blocks together that these edges are on the sides. These are going to be flat up against an edge. Now when we do the joint constraint, we always want to choose what's going to move first, and then we go what's moving to second. Now while I'm here right now, I have this grid right here, and I'm going to take off my layout grid just as I look through here. I have snapped a grid on, that's fine, but I kind of want to get rid of that grid. It makes it a little bit easier to see. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up to joint, and I always like to choose the bottom of objects and then the top of other objects as we put things together. When we go to motion, you're going to see I have rigid right here. I go back to position, and you can see that our base plate looks like it's kind of like made out of water. And what that means is it's saying, what are you moving to the base plate? And I'm going to zoom in here on the bottom, and I'm going to find myself a corner, and you can see how that corner is kind of laying flat. It's very important you don't choose like a side like this. I want the bottom of the object. So sometimes you got to zoom in a little bit to get that. That little blue arrow is pointing down, and that's the Z-axis over here. I'm going to go back to my home. I'm going to look down on top, and now I'm going to kind of zoom in here on this corner. That's where it'll snap, and I want to see those two blue pieces meet each other. And it's important for what we're going to do that these curves line up with other curves when we start placing things. You'll see on one side of this, you kind of see this curve, and on the other side of this, you see a more rigid 90-degree angle. That's going to be very important as we go on. I'm going to say OK. And now as I say OK, I can't move this. It now has a rigid constraint as we've gone in and placed it. So we've done this corner piece right here. I'm going to keep the ones that have holes in them for last. We're going to do this other piece over here that kind of slides into this little groove. So I'm going to click and hold down and drag this out. And automatically it kind of sees where it's going to go, but I'm going to drag this up right about here. And remember, one of the neat things about Fusion is, you can rotate these however you want when you place them. So even dragging a hold of this little, I call them steering wheels. You grab a hold of these little steering wheels that go around these axis lines. So when we talk about degrees of freedom, there's 6 degrees of freedom. It can go along and around any of the axis lines, and that's important to remember. Along and around the Z, along and around the X, and along and around the Y. And this allows you to go in and do those degrees of freedom as you place an object. I'm going to go ahead and just say OK. Once again, I'm going to look at the bottom of one of our guide blocks, and I'm going to go to Joint. And we're still in rigid. We want to stay in rigid. And I'm going to zoom in here. It's important to zoom in. People try to do this from way too far away sometimes, causes problems. I'm going to click on that corner. Again, we have the circle here where I have this vertical axis line for our Z-axis. If I go back to home and I zoom in on our corner over here on the side, I have that blue line pointing up, and I'm going to click, and it snaps it to that corner. And I'm going to say OK. We now have ourselves two corner guide blocks placed. Notice again that I can see that little 90-degree angle here, and that's going to eventually line up over here. And then over here on this side, I can see that I have this curvature here. There's going to be 2 different guide blocks we'll do for a later video, and that's going to help us create these slider constraints. So now we're going to go ahead and place other corner pieces. So I'm going to drag this one out. And it's important for us to try to figure out which place it'll go. And it automatically kind of intuitively went over here, and it was right in doing so because this curve right here has to line up with this curve. If this was a 90-degree angle, I would not be placing this correctly. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to I'm going to drag this up instead of dragging hold of the circle. The circle allows us more of a free range of motion, but I'm just going to drag it up off that axis line, and I'm going to say OK. And I'm going to look at the bottom of that block. And I'm going to go to Joint, and I'm going to zoom in here. And I have this circle with the blue arrow pointing up again. Let's click on our home button. I'm going to go back down here on this corner. And I'm going to go to that corner right there and snap it into place. And I'm going to say OK. Now the way you need to check, again, I have 2 of these rigid 90-degree angles over here. And then on this other side, I have this more arced, curved opening. Kind of looks like a little keyway, like for a key or something. Next thing we'll do is I'm going to drag out my other piece. And I'm going to let off. Again, we have to make sure that we check. Now yours might not snap directly over here, so you're going to have to rotate yours around or move it a little bit. I'm just going to drag this up and say OK. Now I can tell this is going to be correct because I have these 2 90-degree angle lines here. So once again, I'm going to look at the bottom of the piece, Joint. I'm going to go over to Motion, I see Rigid. I'm going to zoom in right up here at the top, and I'm going to click. I'm going to go to my house button. I'm going to come back here on this corner. And again, it's very important to zoom in. I have that circle laying flat because we have our axis lines pointing up. You're lining these up with axis lines. And I'm going to say OK. And you'll notice if we use our view cube, if I come over to the side, you can see 90-degree angles. I can see arches on each side. Before you accept what you've done, you need to rotate around in your side views and make sure this is correct. Now one thing you'll notice as we go through, there's all these little icons, and these mean rigid constraints. If I go to Joint and I go to Motion, you can see this little rigid constraint icon. I can see all these icons, and you might think, I don't want to look at those. We're kind of done with this part of the construction. We have some other things to do, but we're kind of done with this for now. I want to go over here to where it says Joints, and you can see all my joints. I'm going to turn off this little eyeball, and I don't have to look at all those icons anymore. You might say, but there was one left right down here. That one left is from my subassembly I had for the base plate. So I can come in here, maybe find that rigid joint right there and turn it off. So we have placed now all of our corner guide blocks onto our base plate. If by chance your construction of your base plate was incorrect, you might have to go back and edit your base plate to where it would fit each of these parts. So this has been a video for how to go about using the rigid constraint within the joint command to place all of your corner guide blocks onto your base plate for your Trammel toy project.